Hey guys, welcome back, it's Meg. Today we're going to be going over Mistweaver as we head into Season 4. We're going to talk about the spec changes that we've had since we last saw these Dragonflight dungeons, and then any remaining concerns after that, as well as a performance prediction and just a quick once-over on the Trinkets. Small disclaimer as always, things are subject to change as we get tuning passes on both our spec and on Trinkets. Mistweaver has received a lot of changes in Dragonflight, and when I say a lot, I mean a lot of changes. So we're going to be taking a look at the things that Mistweaver struggled with in Season 1 and Season 2, and the things that have been done to remedy those issues. The one thing that really stood out to me the most in Season 1 was Mistweaver's weak or unpredictable AoE healing. It was a regular issue to try to heal AoE damage through Vivify and Vivify Cleave, or through Essence Font or Chi Ji, and it simply wasn't enough to keep people alive through the AoE damage. In 10.0.5, Shaylin's Gift was finally reintroduced, but the unpredictability of it was still a massive sore spot for Mistweaver, especially for bosses that we will be seeing again, like Veximus, the Raging Tempest, Karaka, or the trash like the upstairs Ring and Ruby life pools, or its constant cycles of AoE every single trash pack. And finally, in 10.0.7, Legacy of Wisdom was added to the talent tree, which solved the problem of Mistweaver's inability to consistently heal AoE damage. In another patch, I believe it was 10.1, Ancient Teachings also became a split, semi-smart heal rather than a random heal as before, which severely cut down the amount of overhealing and the amount of unpredictability that it had. And this has further been bolstered just by regular healing tuning. The second hurdle that Mistweaver has had to overcome is our survivability problems. In Season 1 and 2 we had about 3 defensives. We had Dampen Harm on a 2-minute cooldown, Diffuse Magic on a 1.5-minute cooldown and for magic only, and Fort Brew, which is either 4 or 6 minutes and is relatively weak considering. You could also make an argument that Life Cocoon is, though it's also our only external, so we're gonna say 3.5. Since then, we have received, in no particular order, buffs to Bounce Back, Expel Harm has been greatly buffed, Chi Cocoons have been added to our Celestial, as well as to an Expel Harm and Thunder Focus Tea interaction, which was also new, 5% stamina while Ancient Teachings is active, and Healing Elixir reworked into a passive kind of pseudo-cheat death, as well as a shorter cooldown on Life Cocoon with a talent. There was also the introduction of Yulon's Grace and Dance of Wind, which are niche but have seen some play in Keys and in Raid. In Season 2, mana was not a concern thanks to the Rashrok's Trinket as well as Mistweaver's Aberrus tier set, which gave tons of mana returns. But in Season 1 there was a few situations where our mana was a bit restricting. Mana Tea was reworked and we have plenty more agency over our mana pool now as a result, as well as general throughput buffs so we get more bang for our buck. In recent history, damage has been pretty rough for Mistweaver. Usually we rely on DPS trinkets to do most of our damage. Thankfully, this has changed for us fairly recently. We still use DPS trinkets when we can, as all healers do, but between various general damage buffs and throughput buffs, which allow more time spent DPSing, we can hold our own when it comes to overall damage without requiring DPS trinkets to prevent us from falling so far behind. Season 1 was the meta of Lust healers, and Season 2 was literally just Holy Paladin. Mistweaver has access to multiple party buffs, though they don't tend to be valued as heavily as things like Power Word Fortitude or Mark of the Wild. Mistweaver also has access to multiple stops in CC, however we lack a Brez or Lust. These have always been limiting factors, and it remains a design issue for not just Mistweaver but for all specs. However, thankfully, we can finally contribute to group survivability outside of our crowd control and our throughput. With the introduction of Chi Cocoons and later the buffing of Chi Cocoons, we can help prevent one-shots on players other than ourselves, and this has been a long-standing issue for Mistweaver that is finally taken care of. This is another place where the shortened Life Cocoon cooldown is also relevant. And finally, Mistweaver in Dragonflight has been pretty punishing for normal play with certain mechanics, and even more punishing for mistakes. Early Dragonflight was extremely difficult in Season 1 between all of the issues we had with surviving and throughput, in addition to overly punishing mechanics within the spec. Phaline Stomp, or Jadefire Stomp as it's now been renamed, caught a lot of flack in Season 1 for being beginner unfriendly, unintuitive, and hard to play around, and while it was difficult, it wasn't impossible. It was just very different than the Mistweaver of Shadowlands, and a lot of people had issues with the mechanics of the spec itself. It's still a complicated spec and it can be challenging to play at times, but with a ton of quality of life changes to Jadefire Stomp and other abilities with target caps or range limits, this is a much more polished version of Mistweaver and it is a lot more lenient than it was early in Dragonflight Season 1. All of these changes are extremely beneficial to us, and when we look back at the dungeons that we were in Season 1, you think about the issues that we had and how nice it's going to be to revisit these dungeons with a much more fleshed out version of the spec after receiving an entire rework coming from Shadowlands into Dragonflight. That being said, I do have a couple remaining concerns as we head into Season 4 and later in the future into the War Within Season 1. Despite all of the buffs to Mistweaver, our damage seems as though it regularly falls behind after the buffs. Our single target tends to be lower than other healers, and I do think that it's partially because of raid, as well as the fact that we do have damage to healing conversions, but I would really hate to be in the situation again where our damage falls so far behind everyone else that we need to resort to running full DPS builds at the risk of sacrificing some healing when we don't have space to sacrifice healing. I mentioned it a bit earlier, but Mistweaver is somewhat of a niche healer. We regularly are in situations where Mistweaver can do one thing, but another healer can do that and more, or that and better, or while doing more damage, or providing more utility, or freeing up the composition due to having some type of unique utility. Whereas currently, the wall and keys in Season 3 is surviving one-shots and meeting a number of heal checks, which Mistweaver can do very well. I worry that if the dungeon pool or tuning shifts back to being a healer DPS meta and a no heal check meta, then Mistweaver would once again find itself pretty undesirable. We have a plethora of group utility, but we don't have that edge other than throughput, which isn't super unique, and self-survivability. And lastly, I am extremely worried about an overcorrection on tuning due to Mistweaver's survivability and throughput. Ever since 10.1, I'm not gonna lie, I have been waiting for that hammer to drop, and every time we're mentioned in patch notes, it's just a buff, so it's gonna happen eventually, that bubble's gonna pop. But I am very worried that they're going to over-nerf us, and we're just gonna be right back to where we were in the early stages of the expansion. All of that said, I do think that Mistweaver is going to be in a very good spot for these dungeons. I think that mechanics-wise, we handle a lot of situations very well now that we have received an entire expansion's worth of tuning and buffs and spec changes, and I think that we are in for a really fun Fated season. We also have some dungeon changes that happened, and we no longer have to worry about thundering, quaking, explosive, grievous. None of those exist anymore, and we have nerfed versions of other affixes that are going to be a little bit more manageable. There's a lot of trash that has been nerfed, there's a lot of bosses that have been nerfed, there are a lot of bosses that have been changed or buffed as well, but I do think that overall a lot of these dungeons got some really nice improvements since the last time that we saw them. So I'm happy to see those, and I do think that a majority of them work in our favor. Just taking a quick look at the trinkets. Please don't be mad at me if these get nerfed. I'm sure there's a patch coming, but I've waited long enough to do this video. So just taking a quick look at the trinkets for raid. On the radar we have our Smoldering Seedling as we have been playing for the past year. If this remains unnerfed, it's still going to be super strong and you're going to want to grab this. Next up is Neltharion's Call to Dominance. This is our class trinket returning from the Aberrus raid. This thing was pretty nutty. It was used in the tier after its introduction in the world first kill, so it kind of gives you an idea. It's at that higher eye level, and that is still going to be one of our better trinkets, again, pending nerfs. And from the same raid, we have Vrashok's Molten Heart. In its time, this was actually one of my favorite healer trinkets that they've ever made. I think that this thing was awesome. That being said, it did get nerfed significantly at the end of its tier, and I'm not super wild about it, but the versatility is undeniable as well as the healing that it provides. The mana is not quite as nutty as it used to be, but this is still one of the better options with what we know right now. There's a couple other options as well that aren't bad but aren't the best, but with the token system that we're getting, I am most likely going to go with Call of Dominance and Smoldering Seedling. Again, pending nerfs. Please don't get mad at me if these get changed. Big fan of Rage Heart, that is returning as well. This is a tank trinket, though it gives versatility, which is very good for us, as well as does damage and has a massive shield. This may get nerfed, considering that quite literally everyone in high keys uses this currently, so I could see this getting a bit of a slap on the wrist, but pending changes, I am probably going to be picking that up for keys. Next up, we have Neltharion's Call to Dominance. Again, this is something that we used back in Season 2, on and off with a couple of other trinkets to play either more offensively or defensively, but overall this is a really solid trinket for keys. Pre-nerf, I used this trinket for the HPS and mostly the versatility that it provides. Post-nerf, I didn't use it at all. Take that however you want. I don't think that this would be my first choice, though it may be useful for certain fights that are going to be returning, like Khajiit in Halls of Infusion. That was kind of where this shined the hardest, so it's an option, but I do believe, changes pending, that I will be taking Farok's Tainted Rageheart or the Call to Dominance. Once again, there is actually quite a few trinkets that we can pick from for keys. Ward of the Faceless Ire would be replacing Rageheart if you find that you don't have issues surviving but you may want your group to have some defensives. Beacon, or I believe the better option would just be Bellarellos the Suncaller from this tier. If you have some really high prio damage that needs to happen, like the last boss of Brackenhide for example, would be good there. General damage, Iceblood Death Snare is back on the board as well. So you can kind of pick and choose what you want between damage, survivability, healing, or throughput, and you can pick from there. But I do believe that my Farok and my Call are going to be my biggest options, and then maybe we'll see some Ward and some Iceblood, as well as some Bellarellos. That is all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to hit me up while I'm live on either Twitch or YouTube, or in the comments or in my Discord. Thank you guys for watching. See you next time.